For as long as you can remember, there's been a strange tension living inside you. A pull from two worlds. A quiet fracture beneath the surface of your thoughts. A sense that something in you is missing, yet calling you at the same time. You've tried to explain it. You've tried to silence it. You've tried to fit into the world everyone else seems so comfortable inside, but the feeling never left. Carl Jung once wrote that, "The greatest burden a soul can carry is the unlived life within it." He wasn't speaking about ambition. He wasn't speaking about dreams. He was speaking about the forgotten self, the radiant part of you that was buried long before you even had a name. Tonight we go into the place where Jung himself descended, the underworld of the psyche, the realm where Gnosis lives, and where the lost fragments of your soul still wait for you. Because Jung wasn't simply a psychologist. He was something far more dangerous, a modern initiate who rediscovered the ancient Gnostic map of the soul, not through belief, but through experience. There is a reason his private journals were hidden for decades. There is a reason the church mistrusted him. And there is a reason his visions resemble the secret cosmologies of the ancient Gnostics, more than they resemble modern psychology. He didn't study the Gnostics. He recognized himself in them. Before we go deeper, take a breath with me. And if this is your first time here, welcome to Gnostic Codex. If this knowledge calls to you, subscribe, leave a like, and comment where in the world you're watching from, because people like you are scattered across the planet but united by the same hidden memory. Now, let's step into the world Jung tried to map. The world where your shadow speaks, your inner light waits, and the forgotten Gnosis rises again. Most people believe Carl Jung built his psychology by studying patients. But the truth is stranger. Jung didn't discover the unconscious by looking outward. He discovered it by falling inward, into a darkness so deep that he feared he was losing his mind. In 1913, something broke open inside him. He began hearing voices, seeing visions, feeling the world around him dissolving as if a veil had been torn. He wrote, "It was as if the ground beneath my feet gave way and I fell into a deep, dark hole." This descent wasn't metaphorical. It was literal. A psychic initiation that mirrored the ancient Gnostic myth of the soul descending into chaos. Night after night, Jung faced images that felt older than humanity itself. Serpents of fire, great feminine presences, prophets, demons, gods, and a wise old figure who called himself Philemon, a being Jung insisted was not a fantasy, but a real intelligence from a deeper layer of reality. These visions became the foundation for what we know today as shadow work archetypes, the anima and animus individuation, active imagination, and the concept of the self. But Jung admitted something extraordinary. My most important ideas came from things I experienced in the depths. I have never invented anything. This is where the Gnostic connection becomes undeniable. Because the ancient Gnostics believed exactly the same thing. They taught that true knowledge, Gnosis, doesn't come from teachers, institutions, or books. It comes from the inner descent, the confrontation with one's own darkness, the encounter with the divine spark hidden inside chaos. Jung called this descent the confrontation with the unconscious. The Gnostics called it the journey through the Archons. Different language, same initiation. And when Jung finally started writing down what he saw in the drawings, the dialogues, the revelations, he created something so powerful and dangerous that it remained locked away for decades. A book that looked less like psychology and more like a lost gospel, the Red Book. A text that mirrors Gnostic scripture so closely that scholars still debate whether it is a psychological journal or a modern revelation. Inside it, Jung writes, "The God you seek is within you, but he is divided and must be made whole." This is not psychology. This is the Gnostic doctrine of the split self. The fall, the forgetting, the descent into illusion. Jung wasn't studying the Gnostics. He was reliving their map. Because to the Gnostics, the world wasn't just a physical place. It was a psychological prison, a realm shaped by a false creator, a force that keeps humanity asleep. Jung saw the same thing in the psyche. He called this force the ego, the counterfeit self, the inner tyrant that pretends to be the whole of who you are. And just like the demiurge, the ego says, "I am the only God you need." But Jung learned something the Gnostics already knew. The ego is not the ruler. It is the jailer. And the true self, the divine core of your being, is the prisoner waiting to be rediscovered. This realization changed Jung forever. Because the people he once saw as patients, he now recognized as seekers, souls in exile, beings carrying fragments of a forgotten light. He once wrote, "Every person has a God image within them, and it is our life's task to uncover it." To Jung, the self was not just psychological, it was sacred. It was the inner Christ, the inner Sophia, the lost fullness, the Pleroma, waiting to be reborn in consciousness. And in this moment, Jung crossed the threshold from psychology into a path the ancient world once feared, the path of inner awakening. As Jung continued descending into the inner world, he began noticing something unsettling. The symbols he saw in visions, the figures that appeared to him, the architecture of the psychic underworld, they were not new. They belonged to a tradition nearly 2,000 years old, a tradition condemned as heresy, burned, erased, and buried beneath the weight of orthodox religion, the Gnostics. While reading ancient Gnostic fragments, Jung wrote, "I found the ideas of the Gnostics to be the closest to my own experiences. Not his theories, not his philosophy, his experiences. This wasn't academic admiration, it was recognition, a shock, like finding a map drawn by someone who walked your path centuries before you were born." Jung realized that the visions he had feared, the voices he had nearly lost his sanity to, the images that rose from the depths of his psyche, were the same ones the Gnostics described. The Gnostics spoke of Archons, psychological forces that distort perception, the demiurge, the false self that rules through fear, Sophia, the divine wisdom trapped in matter, the divine spark, the hidden self, the Pleroma, the fullness of the true God, Gnosis, direct experience of the inner source, the soul's fall, fragmentation and forgetfulness, the ascent, reintegration and awakening. Jung saw all of this in his visions. He experienced all of it in his descent. He once said, "The Gnostics described the psyche as if they were modern psychologists." But the truth is even stronger. Jung was describing the psyche as if he were an ancient Gnostic. He wasn't borrowing their ideas. He was rediscovering them. This is why he defended them when no one else would. Why he said their writings were not superstition, but psychological revelations. Why he believed the Church destroyed Gnosticism not because it was false, but because it threatened the external authority of institutions. The Gnostics taught that salvation doesn't come from outside, not from priests, not from dogma, not from obedience. Salvation comes from one place only, remembering who you are beneath the illusions of the world. And this is the center of Jung's psychology: individuation, shadow integration, discovering the inner self, reclaiming fragmented parts, transcending the ego, awakening to fullness. He didn't call it Gnosis, but that's precisely what it was. One day, while studying the Gnostic text Pistis Sophia, Jung made a confession that still shocks scholars. The Gnostics were my brothers. Their worldview is the most perfect image of my own. With this realization, Jung began seeing the psyche as a living cosmology, a universe structured like the Gnostic myth itself. The unconscious held realms, beings, forces, light, darkness, divine potential, and parasitic energies. He wrote, "Everything the Gnostics said about the cosmos is true if we understand it as describing the inner cosmos." And suddenly everything made sense. The demiurge is the ego. The archons are psychological complexes. Sophia is the lost wisdom of the soul. The divine spark is the self. Gnosis is individuation, the return to wholeness. The Pleroma is the totality of your being. Jung realized the Gnostics were not heretics. They were pioneers of inner science. They mapped the soul long before modern psychology existed, and they paid the price for it. Burned manuscripts, destroyed schools, silenced teachers, lost gospels, forgotten wisdom. But Jung brought it back, quietly, symbolically, hidden beneath the language of psychology. Because he knew the world wasn't ready to hear that the ancient heretics had understood the mind better than centuries of theologians. And he also knew this. The same ancient journey the Gnostics described is happening inside every human being today, including you. That restless feeling inside you, that inner fracture, that sense of being exiled from something unnamed, the Gnostics knew it, Jung knew it, and now you're beginning to remember it too. There is a part of you that you do not show to the world, a part you hide, deny, fear, or refuse to acknowledge. Jung called this the shadow. To him, the shadow wasn't evil. It wasn't darkness for the sake of darkness. It was something far more tragic. The shadow is everything you left behind in order to become who the world asked you to be. This is not psychology. This is exile. And no one understood exile better than the Gnostics. They taught that the human soul did not enter this world whole. It arrived here fractured, split by the descent into matter, broken by forgetfulness, scattered across layers of illusion. The Gnostics described this fracture as the fall of the soul. Jung described it as the split between ego and shadow. Two languages, one truth. When you were a child, there were parts of you the world rejected. Your power, your intensity, your desire, your inner knowing, your instinct, your imagination, your voice, your light. Piece by piece, you exiled them into the unconscious. That is the shadow. It is not the monster under the bed, it is the forgotten king, the silenced queen, the exiled heir of your inner throne. The Gnostics taught that the soul's fragments fall into the lower realms where Archons feed on them, distorting your perception and keeping you spiritually asleep. Jung taught the same through psychology. Unintegrated shadow becomes fuel for anxiety, projections, addictions, self-sabotage, fear, emotional paralysis, relationship chaos, spiritual blindness. Anything you do not face within returns to rule you from below. Just like the Archons. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The Gnostics would have said, "Until you retrieve your lost fragments, the Archons will write your destiny for you." And this is why shadow work is not self-help. It is not therapy. It is not journaling. Shadow work is soul retrieval. It is the same process the ancient mystics called apokatastasis, the restoration of what was lost. When you face the shadow, you are not confronting darkness. You are rescuing your own light from the places you abandoned it. Every fear you face, every wound you acknowledge, every emotion you allow to speak, is a fragment of your being returning home. Jung believed that without integrating the shadow, there is no awakening, no self, no gnosis. The ancient Gnostics agreed, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Gospel of Thomas. The shadow is the gatekeeper, not the enemy, not the obstacle, but the threshold between your ordinary self and your forgotten divinity. To reject the shadow is to remain divided. To integrate the shadow is to begin the path toward wholeness. The same path Jung walked and the Gnostics protected. And it is only when the shadow is faced that you begin to see the deeper structure of the psyche, the inner tyrant, the false ruler, the psychological demiurge that governs the divided self. And that is where we go next. If the shadow is the forgotten part of you, then the ego is the part that pretends to be the whole. Jung once wrote, "The ego imagines itself the master of the psyche, yet it is only a tiny island in a vast sea." The Gnostic said something strikingly similar. The demiurge believes he is the only God, but he is blind. Two worlds, two languages, one truth. The ego, the psychological demiurge, is the inner architect of illusion, not because it is evil, but because it is terrified. The ego was born to protect you in a world that does not remember the divine, a world of punishment, comparison, survival, a world shaped by fear. In such a world, the ego says, stay small, fit in, don't shine, don't feel too much, don't remember who you are, because to awaken is to threaten the very structure the ego built to keep you safe. The Gnostics saw this clearly. They described the demiurge as the ruler of the material illusion, the maker of false laws, the enforcer of hierarchy and fear, the blind God who says, I am the only one. This is the ego's voice. the voice that mistakes identity for essence, the voice that replaces truth with narrative, the voice that fears anything it cannot control. The ego says, "You are what happened to you. You are your past. You are your wounds. You are your name, your body, your history. You are this small." But the Gnostics taught, and Jung confirmed through lived experience, you are not the prison. You are the prisoner waking up inside it. The ego is the warden, the one who guards the cell but cannot see outside its own walls. Jung wrote, "The ego is the figurehead of consciousness, but the self is the ruler." And this is exactly what the Gnostics described when they said the demiurge is not the true God, only a temporary ruler who knows nothing of the divine spark hidden within the human soul. The ego governs by fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of the unknown, fear of loss, fear of death. It is a psychology built on scarcity, a cosmology of limitation. But beneath its rule, beneath its noise, beneath its demands lies something the ego cannot comprehend. The self, your true source, your inner fullness, your connection to the Pleroma. The ego says, "Obey." The self whispers, "Remember." The ego says, "You are separate." The self says, "You are whole." The ego says, "Stay asleep. It's safer." The self says, "Wake up. It's time." And here lies the great inner war that Jung uncovered, and the Gnostics mapped millennia ago. A battle between the ruler of the illusion and the spark of the true divine. Between the false center and the real one. Between the maker of the cage and the one who can walk through its walls. This is why awakening feels like conflict. Not because you are broken, but because you are remembering. And nothing threatens the ego more than the return of the forgotten self.
In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of individuation. In Gnostic terms, it is the first ascent beyond the demiurge. But before the ascent can begin, before the ego loosens its grip, you must learn the language of the psyche itself, the forces, the patterns, the ancient currents moving through every human soul. The Gnostics called them aeons. Jung called them archetypes. They are the next layer of the mystery.
If the ego is the false ruler, and the shadow is the forgotten self, then there must be something deeper beneath both. Something older, vaster, and more mysterious. Jung called these forces archetypes. The Gnostics called them aeons. And neither group used the word casually. Archetypes are not personalities. Aeons are not deities. They are structures, patterns of consciousness, currents of psychic energy older than humanity itself. Jung saw them as the great foundations of the psyche, the deep code that shapes dreams, visions, desires, fears, instincts, and every spiritual awakening. The Gnostics saw aeons as emanations of the divine, living aspects of the true source, reflections of a fullness the material world can only imitate. Two perspectives, one reality. Archetypes, the blueprint of the soul. Aeons, the blueprint of the cosmos. And Jung realized something breathtaking. The structure of the psyche and the structure of the cosmos are mirrors of one another. This is pure gnosis. The inner world is not separate from the outer. The macrocosm is reflected in the microcosm. Your psyche is not just personal. It is a doorway into the divine architecture. Let's go deeper. The archetype of the self. The aeon of the Pleroma. The self is the center of the psyche. The wholeness you lost. The divine totality you're slowly remembering. In Gnostic cosmology, this is the Pleroma, the fullness of God before fragmentation. Jung said humans carry an image of the self within them. Gnostic said humans carry a spark of the Pleroma within them. Same truth, different metaphors. The archetype of the shadow. The fall of Sophia. Sophia's fall in Gnostic myth is the moment wisdom becomes trapped in darkness, not evil, but separated from its source. Jung saw the shadow the same way. The shadow is not darkness for its own sake. It is light that has been exiled. Sophia falls to learn. The shadow forms to be integrated. Both journeys are movements toward wholeness. The archetype of the anima. Sophia's light. Anima is the inner feminine, the intuitive voice, the the depth, the imagination, the bridge to the unconscious. Sophia is the Gnostic embodiment of divine wisdom. Both are mediators, guides, inner teachers, bridges between the human and the divine. When Jung encountered feminine figures in visions, he recognized them instantly. A wisdom greater than my own was teaching me. This was his Sophia, the archetype of the animus, the logos. The animus is the inner masculine, clarity, direction, discernment, logos. The Gnostic Christ is also the logos, the ordering principle, the inner guide leading the soul back to its source. When both unite within you, the bridal chamber opens, not externally, but as an inner sacred union. Abraxas and the union of opposites. One of Jung's most shocking revelations came when he encountered a figure named Abraxas in his own visions. Later, he learned Abraxas was already present in Gnostic cosmology, a being that transcends duality and unites opposites. Light and dark, creation and destruction, spirit and matter, archetype, aeon, two names, one force. Jung wrote, Abraxas is the power that contains all opposites in their wholeness. This realization became the cornerstone of his psychology. Healing comes not from purity, but from integration. The Gnostics said the same. Archons, psychological complexes. This is where the connection becomes immensely practical. The Gnostics believed archons distort human perception, keeping the soul trapped in illusion. Jung discovered similar forces in the psyche. Addictions, compulsions, emotional loops, trauma imprints unconscious defenses, thought patterns that override free will. He called them complexes, autonomous psychic entities that behave almost like spirits, because they lock you in narratives that are not your own. Archons, complexes. The effect is the same. They keep you asleep. The inner cosmos is populated with forces. Jung believed the psyche is not empty. It is a living world, full of beings, symbols, voices, currents, and structures that operate whether you acknowledge them or not. The Gnostics said, and the heavens are full. Not physically, psychologically. The cosmic story is not out there. It's in here. And this leads us to the most radical idea Jung ever uncovered, the idea that connects him directly to ancient Gnosis. The path of awakening is not about becoming good or pure. It is about becoming whole. And wholeness requires integrating all the forces within you, light and shadow, feminine and masculine, ego and self, mortality and divinity. Jung discovered this through direct experience. The Gnostics preserved it through myth. But both agree. The journey toward wholeness is the true salvation, and this journey has a name. If there is a single place where Jung and the ancient Gnostics meet with almost perfect precision, it is in their understanding of the feminine. Not the social feminine, not the cultural feminine, but the inner feminine, the metaphysical feminine, the forgotten source of wisdom that both the psyche and the cosmos depend on. To the Gnostics, this force had a name, Sophia. To Jung, she was the anima. And both traditions agreed. When the feminine is lost, the soul fractures. When the feminine returns, the soul remembers. Jung saw that every human psyche, regardless of gender, carries an inner feminine presence. This anima was not a fantasy or a mood. She was a guide, a mediator, a bridge to the deeper realms of the unconscious. He described her as the voice that speaks when logic has reached its limit, the presence that appears when the rational mind collapses, the inner figure who knows truths the ego cannot grasp. The Gnostics described Sophia the same way. She is the one who descended into the lower realms seeking deeper knowledge, and in that descent became trapped in the world of illusion. Her fall created a cosmic longing, a wound in the structure of existence itself. For Jung, the anima is that wound within the individual, a fragment of the soul separated from consciousness, a lost wisdom waiting to be integrated. Sophia's story is our story. Her exile is our inner disconnection. Her cry is the same instinct that drives us toward awakening. Jung once wrote, Sophia is the eternal wisdom that man has forgotten. Her return is the beginning of healing. When Jung met feminine figures in his visions, he understood that he was not encountering symbols only. He was meeting the part of the psyche that sees beyond the ego, beyond the surface of things into the depths where the self lives. Sophia, in Gnostic cosmology, makes the same journey. She descends into darkness, and through that descent, she awakens humanity. Because the true feminine does not obey. She reveals. She reveals the illusions of the demiurge. She reveals the traps of the Archons. She reveals the deeper structure beneath the world's surface. And Jung saw Anima doing exactly this. She reveals hidden desires. She reveals unspoken truths. She reveals wounds the ego denies. She reveals the path to the self. She reveals the wholeness the conscious mind refuses to see. The anima is not the shadow, though she lives close to it. She is not the ego, though she often confronts it. She is the soul's mirror, the lost memory of unity, the whisper of the Pleroma speaking inside the human heart. The Gnostics said Sophia's return marks the beginning of liberation. Jung said integrating the anima marks the beginning of individuation. Again, two traditions. One truth. Wholeness is impossible without the return of the feminine that was exiled long ago. This is why Jung believed modern society suffers from a spiritual illness, the repression of the feminine, the loss of intuition, the dismissal of inner knowledge, the devaluation of dreams, symbols, imagination, and silence. The world worships the demiurge, logic without soul, order without wisdom, control without depth. But Jung said the cure is not rebellion, it is reunion. Reunion with the inner Sophia, reunion with the anima, reunion with the forgotten voice within. Because until the feminine returns, no man can know his soul, no woman can know her full power, and no human can remember the self. Sophia is the path to the self. Anima is the guide along the way. And when she speaks, if you know how to listen, she leads you directly toward the next phase of the journey, the place where the divine center of your being begins to reveal itself, the place Jung called the self. The Gnostics called it the Pleroma, and that is where we go next. There is a center within you that you have never fully touched, a place that does not break when your life breaks, a place that does not suffer when your mind suffers, a place that does not age, does not fear, does not die. Jung called this center the self. Not the self of ordinary language, not the ego, not the personality, but the self with a capital S, the living core of the psyche, the inner source of meaning, order, and divinity. He wrote, "The self is the God image within. It is both the goal and the origin of the soul." For Jung, the self was not a metaphor. It was a presence, a field, a reality more fundamental than the ego, more ancient than the body, and more enduring than any life story. To the Gnostics, this inner reality had a different name, the Pleroma, the fullness, the totality of being, the realm of the true God before fragmentation occurred. And the spark within the human soul was a fragment of that Pleroma, exiled into a world of illusion, waiting to remember its origin. Jung saw the exact same structure inside the psyche. He saw that every human being carries within them a latent totality, a hidden wholeness, a light untouched by trauma, conditioning, or the narratives of the world. It is why people feel an inner longing that no achievement, relationship, or possession can satisfy. It is why we feel a quiet ache when we stare at the night sky, why certain dreams feel more real than waking life, why symbols move us in ways logic cannot explain. The soul remembers, the ego forgets, but the deeper self never does. Jung believed the self communicates through symbols, synchronicities, dreams, intuition, visions, and moments of sudden clarity. The Gnostics said the same. They taught that the Pleroma speaks through the divine spark, the voice within the hidden teacher, the call to awakening. Jung wrote, "The self guides us like a hidden God." The Gnostics said, "When you know yourself, you know the divine." Both point to the same revelation. The ultimate truth does not come from outside. It rises from within, not through belief, not through doctrine, but through direct inner experience. This is why Jung rejected the idea that religion should be obeyed blindly. He believed its purpose was to lead the individual to the inner encounter with the self, an encounter that transforms everything it touches. When the self emerges, the ego feels threatened. Life begins to shift. Old identities fall away. Relationships change. Priorities collapse. Dreams intensify. Synchronicities multiply. The unconscious begins to reorganize itself. Because the self is not passive, it is active. It is seeking reunion with you as much as you are seeking reunion with it. To Jung, this reunion is the purpose of life. To the Gnostics, this reunion is salvation. But Jung added something profoundly intimate. The self is not simply divine. It is personal. It knows you. It calls you. It waits for you. It shapes circumstances, dreams, and symbols to draw you toward wholeness. One of his most famous lines reads, "The self is our life's goal, for it is the center of our being." The Gnostics would have said, "The Pleroma is our home, and the spark longs to return." This longing is the root of your restlessness, the echo you have felt your entire life, the sense that something in you is incomplete, unfinished, awaiting recognition. Jung discovered that the self appears when the ego can no longer pretend to be in control, when the illusions break, when the old structures collapse, when the shadow has been faced, when Sophia begins to rise. At that moment, the inner God image awakens. The self does not descend from above, it emerges from within, and this emergence marks the beginning of the true spiritual path, the Gnostic ascent, the recovery of fullness, the return to the Pleroma. But awakening to the self is not the end of the journey. It is the threshold. Now comes the deeper work, the path of integration, the restoration of what was divided. Jung called this process individuation. The Gnostics called it Gnosis, and that is where the journey leads next. If the self is the inner God image and the Pleroma is the cosmic fullness from which the soul once came, then the question becomes unavoidable. How does a human being return to this wholeness? Jung spent nearly his entire life answering this question. The ancient Gnostics answered it centuries before him. Their answers are mirror images. Jung called the path individuation. The Gnostics called it Gnosis. Both words describe the same journey, not self-improvement, not moral purification, but the restoration of what was divided inside you. Individuation begins the moment the ego realizes it is not the master of the house. Gnosis begins when the soul awakens to the fact that the world is not what it seems. Both start with a rupture, a crack in the illusion, a sense that the old life can no longer be lived. This crack is not a failure, it is an invitation. The journey itself moves through stages, though they never appear cleanly separated in real life. They unfold like seasons, each one preparing the next. Let's walk through them. Stage 1. The breaking of the persona, the collapse of the mask. The persona is the mask you built to survive the world. The image you present, the roles you perform, the expectations you try to meet. Individuation begins when the persona becomes unbearable, when the life you are living no longer feels like the life you were meant to live. The Gnostics describe this as the moment the soul wakes within the prison, the moment the spark realizes the walls surrounding it were never real. This is why awakening often feels like crisis. The mask must crack before the true face can emerge. Stage 2. Confronting the shadow, the descent into the underworld. Once the persona cracks, the hidden material erupts. Old wounds, repressed anger, forgotten memories, unlived desires, fear, envy, shame. All the fragments you pushed away rise from the depths. Jung said, "No one becomes illuminated by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The Gnostics preserved this same truth in myth. Sophia does not rise until she descends. The soul does not awaken until it confronts the darkness it carries. This descent is not punishment. It is purification through truth. And truth is the only force the ego cannot manipulate. Stage 3. Encounter with the inner feminine or inner masculine. Anima, animus, Sophia, logos. No one enters the depths without guidance. Jung found that the unconscious provides a mediator, a figure who bridges the earthly self with the deeper world of the psyche. This is the anima for men, the Animus for women. The Gnostics spoke of the same guide, Sophia for the wandering soul, the Logos for the lost spark. These inner figures teach, challenge, confront, and correct. They are not fantasies. They are structures of meaning, the soul's way of speaking to itself when words are not enough. The bridal chamber symbol in Gnostic texts is not a ritual. It is the moment when these inner opposites finally embrace. Individuation and Gnosis both hinge on this union. Stage 4, the emergence of the self, the appearance of the inner center. After the descent, after the confrontation, after the inner union begins, something extraordinary happens. A new center appears, not the ego, but the self, the inner God image, the source of meaning, the quiet power that has been waiting beneath everything. Jung said this moment feels like a light rising from within. The Gnostics said it feels like remembering the world you came from. This emergence is not bliss. It is clarity. It is seeing without distortion. It is recognizing that the divine was never distant. It was buried. The self begins to organize your life around truth, not conditioning. Around purpose, not fear. Around authenticity, not performance. And the outer world reacts. Some people drift away. Some become threatened. Some recognize something in you they forgot in themselves. This is normal. The more whole you become, the more the illusion around you destabilizes. Stage 5, integration and the ascent, becoming what you always were. The final stage is not the disappearance of the ego, but its reorientation. The ego is no longer the ruler, it becomes the servant of the self. This is the moment the Gnostics called the ascent through the spheres. Not a literal journey through the stars, but the shedding of old identities. The Archons of the psyche that once controlled you. Anger loses its grip, fear recedes, patterns break. Old wounds stop deciding your fate. You do not become perfect, you become real, you become whole. And wholeness is liberation. Wholeness is Gnosis. Wholeness is the soul remembering its source while still inhabiting the world below. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The Gnostics wrote, "When the two become one, you will enter the kingdom." Individuation is the psychological map. Gnosis is the spiritual map. Both lead to the same destination, the return to your fullness, the restoration of your original nature, the reunion with the spark that never died. But there is still one more obstacle ahead, the force that seeks to keep you from reaching that wholeness. The Gnostics called them Archons. Jung called them complexes. And in the next block we descend into this final frontier. If the self is the inner God image and individuation is the road back to wholeness, then you must ask the question the Gnostics never ignored. What keeps human beings asleep? Why do so many live below their potential, afraid of their own depth, haunted by emotions they cannot explain, sabotaging the very awakening they claim to seek? The ancient Gnostics had one answer: Archons. Jung had another word for the same phenomenon: complexes. They are not external demons. They are internal rulers, autonomous pockets of psyche that behave as if they were independent beings. Both traditions agree on one thing: your greatest obstacles are not outside you. They live inside the fractured psyche itself. The Gnostic view: Archons as psychic parasites. The Gnostics described the Archons as rulers of the lower world, forces that govern forgetfulness, entities that feed on ignorance and emotional distortion. They did not imagine monsters. They described psychological forces: fear, guilt, shame, compulsions, addictive patterns, self-hatred, envy, rage, despair. These are not random emotions. They are energetic structures, patterns that possess, forces that loop, voices that whisper, walls that cage. The Archons operate in the same way Jung later described his complexes. They take over the psyche. They speak through you. They decide for you. They sabotage your awakening because your awakening threatens their existence. The Gnostics said, the Archons bind the soul with chains of passion. Jung said, the complex has you, not the other way around. They are two languages for the same reality. The Jungian view: complexes as autonomous beings. Jung discovered something radical. Parts of the psyche behave like separate personalities. They interrupt your thoughts, hijack your emotions, pull you back into old wounds, and repeat the same suffering endlessly. A complex has its own agenda, its own emotions, its own worldview. When it is activated, it eclipses your consciousness. You suddenly become someone else. The Gnostics saw this, but they described it symbolically. When an Archon seizes the soul, it traps the spark beneath layers of illusion. Jung told the same truth without myth. A complex blocks the path to individuation and keeps the ego from reaching the self. In both systems, the inner rulers feed on fragmentation. Your disunity is their nourishment. Your awakening is their death. The inner battlefield. The moment you attempt real inner work, the Archons rise, the complexes activate, the shadow intensifies. Because now you are no longer unconscious. You are no longer easy to control. You are moving toward wholeness, and wholeness dissolves them. So they fight. Not with swords, but with thoughts. You're not enough. You'll fail. You're unlovable. Stay small. Don't change. Don't wake up. The Gnostics recognized these voices and encoded them in myth. Jung recognized these same voices and mapped them clinically. Different tools, same enemy. The tactics of the Archons, complexes they operate through. Emotional loops, repeating cycles of suffering. Self-sabotage, killing momentum right before breakthrough. Projection, making others carry your inner wounds. Distraction, anything to keep you away from inner truth. Inflation, spiritual pride and false enlightenment. Despair, the belief that change is impossible. At the psychological level, these are complexes. At the symbolic level, these are Archons. The Gnostics warned, those who forget themselves become food for the rulers. Jung said, what you fail to make conscious will control your life, and you will call it fate. They are describing the same prison. The only escape, conscious awareness. Both Jung and the Gnostics agreed. You cannot defeat these forces through denial, repression, or moral effort. You defeat them by seeing them, by bringing them into consciousness, by shining the light of the self on them, by refusing to identify with them. Gnosis is knowledge. Individuation is integration. To name the force is to break its spell. To witness the emotion is to dissolve its control. To hold awareness steady is to reclaim the power the Archons stole. The Gnostics called this passing through the spheres. Jung called it disidentification from the complex. You ascend each time you refuse to collapse into your old patterns. You rise each time you remain conscious while the inner rulers attempt to drag you back. This is spiritual warfare not with the world, but with your own unconscious. The final adversary, the false self. At the end of this internal struggle, you meet the last Archon, the strongest complex, the first mask you ever created. The false self, the self built from fear, the self shaped by conditioning, the self that exists only to be approved. It is the guardian of the prison. It uses every voice, every wound, every insecurity to keep you asleep. But once you see it, once you truly recognize it as a structure created, not your essence, its power dissolves. The false self cannot survive in the presence of the self. And this moment is where Gnosis begins. The revelation both traditions point toward. Jung discovered the self through psychology. The Gnostics discovered it through mysticism. But both reached the same conclusion. There is something inside you that is older than the world, untouched by trauma, unharmed by your past, unshaken by fear. Something watching, something knowing, something whole. The Archons cannot touch it. The complexes cannot distort it. It is the flame behind your eyes, the witness, the still point, the spark. The Gnostics called it the divine seed. Jung called it the self. Both meant the same thing, the part of you that already knows the way home. If Jung had stopped at mapping symptoms, he would have been remembered as a psychologist. But Jung crossed a boundary most modern thinkers fear to even approach. He discovered the self, not as a metaphor and not as a philosophical idea, but as a living presence at the center of human consciousness, a presence older than the ego, older than trauma, older than human history, a presence that behaves as if it were divine. And here the parallel with Gnosis becomes unavoidable, because centuries earlier the Gnostics described this same presence with a different name: the divine spark, the fragment of the Pleroma, the uncreated light. Two traditions separated by time, culture, and language, yet pointing to the same phenomenon. Both agree: something inside you did not originate in this world. Something entered with you when you crossed the threshold into matter. Something that remembers what you have forgotten. The ego, the wandering stranger, a temporary identity, a mask, the child of the Archons. Jung never demonized the ego, but he understood its limitations. It is small, it is fragile, it clings to control, it fears chaos, it worships certainty. The ego is the structure that allows you to function in the world of forms, but it is not the center of your being. The Gnostics said the same. The ego is the part of you most deeply entangled in the archonic world, the part shaped by social conditioning, fear, survival, and illusion. The ego thinks it is the whole, but it is merely the surface. A thin shell wrapped around an ancient core. And awakening begins the moment you stop confusing the two. The self, the unmoved source. Within Jung described the self as the organizing principle of the psyche, the totality of who you are and who you can become. But that definition is too clinical for the reality he was pointing toward. What he meant is this: there is a center inside you that is not touched by your story, not touched by your failures, your wounds, your fears, your complexes, or your past. A center that watches, a center that knows, a center that waits for you to remember it. The self is not created, it is revealed. Just like the Gnostic spark cannot be earned, it is already there, buried under layers of forgetfulness. Jung wrote, "The self is our life's goal, the wholeness that transcends the ego." The Gnostics wrote, "The spark longs to return to its original fullness." Different words, same truth. The voice of the self, and why the ego rarely hears it. Both Jung and the Gnostics insisted, the self does not shout. It does not argue with the ego. It does not demand attention. It does not force awakening. It whispers, and you hear it in moments when the noise of the world falls silent. In intuitive clarity. In sudden insight. In dreams that feel older than your body. In impulses toward truth, beauty, or meaning that make no sense to your rational mind. The self communicates through symbols, synchronicities, dream images, and inner knowing. It speaks the language of myth because the rational mind cannot comprehend it directly. The Gnostics knew this. The divine spark calls to the soul in symbols. Jung discovered the same principle thousands of years later and built an entire psychology around it. The self as the inner bridegroom, the Gnostic interpretation. In texts like the Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Philip, Jesus is not only an external teacher, he is also the symbol of the inner fullness the seeker must reunite with. The bridegroom was always a metaphor for the lost higher self, the part of you that remained in the light while another part descended into matter. The bridal chamber, therefore, is the union of the earthly self with the inner self. Jung would later describe this as the Coniunctio, the sacred union of opposites, the integration of consciousness with the self. The parallels are stunning. The self is the divine bridegroom. The ego is the wandering bride. Individuation is the wedding. Wholeness is the new creation born from that union. The self cannot be controlled. Here both Gnosis and Jung converge again. The self does not obey the ego. It cannot be manipulated. It cannot be captured by doctrine. It cannot be confined by institutions. It cannot be threatened by fear. The self emerges only when the ego surrenders control, not collapse, but surrender. Not passivity, but openness. Not weakness, but humility. The Gnostics taught that salvation was not obedience but remembering. Jung taught that healing was not compliance but integration. Both point to the same law. You cannot force wholeness. You can only allow it. The self is not found. It finds you. The ego searches for meaning. The ego strives for enlightenment. The ego chases awakening like a prize. But the self does not respond to effort. It responds to honesty, to stillness, to vulnerability, to courage, to the willingness to face your shadow without running. The Gnostics taught, when the soul becomes still, the spark rises to meet it. Jung said, the self manifests when the ego takes a step back. It is the same truth. The moment you stop pretending, the moment you stop performing, the moment you stop hiding, the self steps forward. The divine spark remembers its flame. Why this teaching was dangerous. Both Jung and the Gnostics paid a high price for revealing these truths. Because once a human being recognizes the self within them, they become sovereign. No institution can control them. No ideology can define them. No external authority can command them. No archon, outer or inner, can dominate them. A person who has met the self is no longer governed by fear. They walk differently. They see differently. They choose differently. They live from a place the world cannot touch. This is why the Gnostics were silenced. This is why Jung was ridiculed. This is why the bridal chamber was hidden. This is why individuation is misunderstood, because a human being who reunites with the self is not manageable. They become what the Gnostics called a light in the world that darkness cannot overcome. If the Gnostics had a map of salvation and Jung had a map of individuation, what happens when you place the two maps on top of each other? They align perfectly. Every step Jung outlined matches a step the Gnostics described 2,000 years earlier, not because Jung copied them. For most of his life, he barely had access to their texts, but because both traditions were describing the same journey, the return of the divided soul to its original fullness. The Gnostics called this fullness the Pleroma, the wholeness, the all, the origin. Jung called it totality, the self, the center and circumference of being. Two languages, one truth. Individuation is simply the psychological expression of what the Gnostics described mystically. Gnosis, the remembering of the forgotten self, the descent. The soul enters the world of forgetting. The Gnostic myth begins with a descent. A spark leaves the Pleroma and enters the world of form. It loses its memory. It forgets its origin. It becomes trapped in layers of illusion ruled by the Archons. Jung described the same phenomenon. When we are born, our original wholeness collapses inward into a small structure called the ego. The ego believes it is the whole, but it is only a fragment. The journey of life is the recovery of what was lost. To the Gnostics, this loss was metaphysical. To Jung, this loss was psychological. But both traditions agree. You begin divided. You begin incomplete. You begin asleep. The awakening. The moment you realize something is missing. Every seeker has a moment, a crack in the surface, and when the illusion thins, a whisper, a dream, a crisis, a quiet dissatisfaction that refuses to die. It is the beginning of the longing for something you cannot name. Jung called this the summons of the self. The Gnostics called it the call of the spark. It is not the ego searching for God. It is the divine within you calling the ego back home. This is the beginning of Gnosis. Not knowledge, recognition, a remembering that does not pass through the mind but rises from the depths. The confrontation, the shadow as the first gate. Both Jung and the Gnostics insisted, you cannot ascend until you confront what has been buried inside you. The archons of fear, shame, anger, guilt. These are not external demons. They are the shadow. Jung wrote, no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The Gnostics expressed it differently. Light is born in the heart of darkness. Individuation demands that you face the very forces that keep you fragmented. Every fear you avoid, every wound you deny, every mask you refuse to remove. These become archons. These become complexes. These become obstacles on the path back to the Pleroma. The first ascent is always downward, because the gate to the higher world is hidden in the underworld of your own psyche. The inner marriage, the Coniunctio and the bridal chamber. Once the shadow is faced and the ego stops defending itself, a subtle shift begins. You feel something watching you, guiding you, moving beneath the surface. This presence is the self, the divine spark. The Gnostics symbolized this moment with the bridal chamber. Jung symbolized it with the Coniunctio, the sacred union of opposites, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, human and divine, form and spirit, fragment and whole. This union is not romantic, it is not physical, it is not conceptual, it is existential. It is the moment you stop being driven by fear and start being guided by inner knowing. The moment the ego bows to the self, the moment the two become one. This is Gnosis, this is individuation, this is rebirth. The ascent, transcending the Archons. In Gnostic cosmology, after the bridal chamber, the soul gains the strength to pass through the cosmic rulers, the layers of conditioned identity that once imprisoned it. Jung described this not cosmologically, but psychologically. As consciousness expands, the complexes lose their power. They stop possessing you. They stop hijacking your choices. They stop defining your fate. You become transparent to them. You see them coming. You recognize their patterns. Where once you were controlled, you become conscious. Where once you were reactive, you become intentional. Where once you were fragmented, you become whole. The Gnostics called this the liberation from the Archons. Jung called it the realization of the self. The return, rejoining the Pleroma. This is the final stage both traditions pointed toward. Not physical death, not escape from the world, not transcendence that rejects matter, but a state of consciousness in which the self inside you recognizes itself again as part of the whole, a return to the fullness that was never truly lost, a homecoming to your original nature. For Jung, this is the completion of individuation, a life in which your actions come from the center, not from fear or fragmentation. For the Gnostics, this is the restoration of the spark, the soul's return to the Pleroma, while still living in a body. This is not an afterlife teaching. It is a state of being available now. A human who lives from this place is not freed from the world, but freed within it. They move through the illusion without being deceived. They walk in the realm of the Archons without being ruled. They carry the Pleroma within their presence. This was the teaching Jesus gave in whispers. This was the wisdom the Gnostics preserved in fragments. This was the truth Jung rediscovered through the unconscious. The journey is the same, and it leads to the same door, the door you have always felt. If you have followed this far, if something inside you has stayed awake through every whisper and every symbol, then you already feel it. This teaching is not foreign to you. It is familiar, as if you are not learning something new, but remembering something ancient. Both Jung and the Gnostics believed that only certain souls respond to this call, not because they are special, but because they carry a deeper memory beneath the surface of their ordinary life. There are signs, quiet signs, subtle signs, signs you may have carried for decades without knowing what they meant. Here are 7 signs that the path of Gnosis, the path of individuation, has already begun in you. Not someday, now. 1. You have always felt like a stranger in this world, not lonely, not alienated but misplaced, as if the world everyone else accepts never fully convinced you. The Gnostic said this feeling comes from the spark remembering the Pleroma. Jung said it comes from the self pressing against the limits of the ego. Either way, your estrangement is a compass. 2. You question what others accept. Without thought. You do not rebel for the sake of rebellion. You simply cannot swallow illusions whole. Institutions, dogmas, collective beliefs. You see through them too easily. Jung called this the revolt of the individual psyche against the mass mind. The Gnostics called it the refusal to bow to the Archons. 3. You feel drawn to the inner world more than the outer dreams. Symbols, synchronicities, depth psychology, spiritual mysteries. You have always sensed that the real landscape of your life is not external. It is internal. This is the self inviting you inward. 4. Your suffering has forced you into transformation, not bitterness. You have been broken, more than once, but each time something deeper woke up inside you. Pain did not destroy you. It carved space. Jung wrote, There is no coming to consciousness without pain. The Gnostics wrote, "Through the wound, the light enters. You live this truth." 5. You sense a presence within you that is not your ego, a deeper intelligence, a quiet knowing, a witness behind your thoughts. Sometimes it guides, sometimes it interrupts, sometimes it simply watches. This is the self, this is the spark, and it has never left you. 6. You feel something, trying to block your growth patterns, doubts, sabotage, inner resistance, outer chaos. Every time you rise, something tries to pull you down. This is not paranoia, it is psychology. Jung called them complexes. The Gnostics called them Archons. They appear only in those who are close to awakening. The resistance confirms the path. 7. You carry a longing you cannot explain. A homesickness for a place you have never seen in this life. A quiet knowing that something inside you is incomplete but moving toward completion. A longing not for escape, but for wholeness. The Gnostic said this longing was the spark remembering its origin. Jung said it was the pull of the self drawing you toward individuation. You feel this longing because your awakening has already begun. The final turn. You are already on the path. Individuation is not a technique. Gnosis is not a doctrine. They are the same movement, the soul turning back toward its own center. The world will try to distract you. Your complexes will try to bind you. The Archons will try to confuse you. Your ego will try to stay in control. But the self does not give up. It waits. It whispers. It guides. It remembers. And now, so do you. You are not beginning the journey. You are recognizing it. The spark inside you has never stopped calling your name. And now you are finally listening. This is the return. This is the remembrance. This is the first step home.